There's a war raging in the world right now between popular characters. There are more monsters and cute girls than you can shake a stick at. I don't have such lofty dreams of creating something that will last for perpetuity. Ken Sugimori, 2017. Pikachu is one of the most recognized fictional characters in the world, but someday it'll be completely forgotten, along with every other Pokemon. Ken was a lonely kid growing up, only able to make friends by drawing manga. Despite his parents' protests, he ran away from home to pursue his dream of becoming a manga author, a mangaka. But life had other plans for him. One fateful day, he skipped school to meet up with a kid named Satoshi, which ultimately led to Ken becoming art director of the biggest multimedia franchise in human history, Pokémon. Deciding to play hooky changed Ken's life and to some extent the whole world. But even after all those billions and billions of dollars, he still wanted to be a mangaka. Now closing in on 60 years of age, Sugimori's finally had to lay that dream to rest. He's far outlived his usefulness, and his art was never even that good to begin with. Or at least that's the way he sees it. Those are his words, not ours. By the end of this video, we expect you'll see things differently. This is Ken Sugimori. For a man who drew all this, and much more, it's shocking how little of his life story is known to the public. Look him up on Wikipedia and everything he ever did is condensed down to a couple paragraphs. Short as it is, it's still got some errors. Even his place of birth is incorrect. Search the internet in Japanese and you won't find much more than in English. The man's practically a ghost. The only way we could learn more about Sugimori was by buying some old Japanese books, translating a few hundred relevant pages, and piecing the puzzle together. So let's start at the very beginning, long before Pokemon. Ken Sugimori was born January 27, 1966 on the island of Kyushu in Fukuoka's downtown Hakata district. His father loved manga, so he grew up surrounded by the classics. But his dad also worked for the TV channel NHK, which required the Sugimori family to move around a lot, to Nagano, Nagasaki, Yamanashi, Tokyo. And as a result, Ken was constantly switching schools and had a hard time making friends. He was good at drawing though, and realized sketching manga was a good way to start conversations with other students. The 70s were a golden age for manga and anime, and Ken could draw popular characters better than anyone, especially Gundam. And when other kids caught a glimpse, it was an instant icebreaker. He filled up entire notebooks with manga and drew them in the margins of his notes during class. At one school, he made a group of friends where he'd draw one page, then another kid drew the next, and so on, till they had a 16-page story. They made hundreds over several years, and Ken still treasures and keeps them to this day. These formative experiences making friends with his art left Ken dreaming of becoming a professional mangaka when he grew up. In his mid-teens, he found a new obsession: arcades. Back then, no one knew who made video games, Sugimori recounted in the 2000 book Game Maestro, Vol.4. I was obsessed, so I'd research and investigate, and I'd say Galaxian was made by a company called Namco. The original Space Invaders was made by Taito, and the other Space Invader-like games are all copies, trivia like that. It was an era where I really wanted to share this kind of knowledge, but no one understood. One day, now living in Tokyo, he popped into a magazine shop and his gaze happened to wander to a video game magazine. It was amateur, homemade, and stapled together, a doujinshi. He'd never seen anything like that. Back in those days, strategy guides, gaming magazines, internet forums, none of this existed yet. This doujinshi Ken held in his hands was Game Freak issue number 1. He bought a copy and pored over its pages. It was full of interests and opinions he shared and contained gaming trivia even he didn't know. I thought it was amazing, he recollected, but while the contents were good, the visuals were lacking. There was no way to screenshot games back then, so all the pictures were hand-drawn, poorly. Game Freak was made by some kid a little younger, Satoshi Tajiri. So, Sugimori mailed him a letter and some illustrations saying he'd like to make the doujinshi's artwork. Satoshi wrote back, saying welcome aboard. The two high schoolers exchanged letters for a while, until one day Satoshi invited Ken to an arcade trade show. It was for industry insiders only. Satoshi spent a lot of money collecting arcade circuit boards, so he was on the invite list, and managed to secure Ken one extra ticket. It was on a weekday though, so Ken dressed up in his school uniform and told his parents he was off to class, then skipped school, ditched his clothes in a train station locker, and ran off to the trade show. Problem was, he still had no idea what Satoshi looked like. He'd have to find him amongst the crowds. All the trade booths had sign-in sheets. When Ken signed his name, he saw Satoshi's a few lines above. I figured he must be close and looked around, and sure enough, there was this tall, lanky guy at the next booth over writing the name, Tajiri. The two immediately hit it off and became the best of friends, spending countless meals and train rides together, talking video games and staying out late nights at the arcade. In '84, 18-year-old Ken graduated high school, 1 year earlier than Satoshi, so he had to step into adult life all on his own. He had no plans to attend college and still determined to become a mangaka, but his mom and dad didn't approve of him lazing around the house drawing all day, so he ran away from home and rented the first cheap apartment that he could find in Machida, the same neighborhood where Satoshi still lived with his parents. Satoshi loved having his friends so close and quickly moved in his computer and most of his stuff. Before he knew it, Ken's little apartment was the new Game Freak office space. Money was tight with Ken working part-time and Satoshi still on his parents' allowance. They mostly ate cheap ramen noodles and spent half their money on video games. Arcades, of course, but eventually they bought a Nintendo Famicom and got really into Super Mario. And Ken especially liked Princess Peach. Even to this day, if you look at his Twitter page, you'll see he's constantly buying Peach memorabilia. His favorite Nintendo game, however, was the original Metroid. Ken's art greatly improved Game Freak, and their doujinshi became some of the world's first strategy guides, with a cult readership of thousands. One issue explaining how to get 10 million points in Xevious was especially influential. We could probably make an entire documentary about these two teenagers' lives in the Xevious scene, which is very dramatic and very long. Tajiri basically wrote an entire book about it. That's still for another time, so for now we'll keep it short and just say Xevious's significance cannot be overstated. Tajiri's been reclusive from the public eye since the late 90s, but he reappeared in 2015 to interview Xevious creator Masanobu Endo. In that interview, Sugimori and Tajiri agree, quote, "Pokemon wouldn't exist without Xevious. Game Freak never would have made their first game without it, and the mysteries surrounding Xevious greatly influenced the mysteries cultivated for Pokemon." Sugimori said, "I think it's important how Endo kept the mysteries ambiguous. That's why when I get asked questions about Pokemon, I try not to answer too clearly. What I learned and value from my Xevious experience is how keeping things vague can make it more enjoyable." After meeting Xevious's creator as teenagers, the Game Freak guys realized the legend was just flesh and bones, just like themselves. So together with some friends, they started making their own game. All their favorite games centered around one verb: digging, shooting, jumping, so they decided to make a Famicom game based on flipping. Tajiri hired a few more guys, rented an apartment to use as an office, and asked Namco, the same company who published Xevious, to publish their first game. Namco agreed, and 3 years later, Quinty hit store shelves, selling 200,000 copies, a massive win for the team. Every month, Sugimori published a 2-page Quinty manga, but his responsibilities at Game Freak left little time to pursue his dreams of becoming a real mangaka. After Quinty, Game Freak started cooking up their next project, a little game called Capsule Monsters. They figured could be made in about 6 months since it was for the Game Boy. The idea for Pokemon was born when Sugimori and Tajiri were playing Dragon Quest II, and Sugimori came into possession of not one, but 2 rare hats. Tajiri desperately wanted one, but there was no way to get his hands on Sugimori's extra, thus burning the idea of trading into their minds. Dragon Quest, Final Fantasy, those were the kind of games everyone was playing back in the 80s. The orthodox fantasy RPGs were what was popular back in those days, Sugimori recollected. But there was also this group of young, ambitious developers who were creating RPGs that took a different path. Our Pokemon Red and Green were developed as part of that trend. It was basically a counterculture movement. The design document imagined a world with over 200 fantasy monsters, most of which could be caught in capsules, battled against each other, and traded with friends over a link cable. Tajiri took it to Ape Inc., the Nintendo-fused studio which just released a popular RPG called Mother. He showed it to producer Tsunekazu Ishihara, who along with Shigeru Miyamoto liked Capsule Monsters enough to fund it and sign on as producers. In the beginning, I just liked to draw kaiju-like monsters, but in a more cartoonish, exaggerated style, Sugimori remembers, but I realized I'd never drawn monsters like that before. I was honestly pretty lost, but I managed to create about 20 or 30 different designs. But their 6-month game plan was dragging on longer than expected, and after spending all their Quinty money on dev equipment, they ran out of cash. So with some help from Ishihara and Miyamoto, it was decided Game Freak would make some smaller games to get some dollars back in their coffers. Half a year later, they released Yoshi on both Famicom and Game Boy, selling 500,000 copies on its first day. Game Freak launched another game around the same time, Jerry Boy for Super Famicom, which won Sugimori an award for character design. He made a Jerry Boy manga as well, plus a few more for Valkyrie no Boken and Shin Maido o Sawagase Shimasu. In 1992, Sugimori directed his first game, Magical Tarurutokun, for Sega Genesis, based on a popular manga of the same name. Capumon was now completely on ice for about 3 years as Game Freak focused on making games like Mario and Wario and Pulseman, the latter of which saw the now 28-year-old Sugimori returning to the director's chair. Pulseman was a direct challenge to Sonic the Hedgehog, with Sugimori saying, "If Sonic can move at the speed of sound, then Pulseman will move at the speed of light." Now with a fistful of yen, Game Freak dove headfirst back into Capsule Monsters, except now they were calling it Pocket Monsters, due to trademark complications. Unfortunately, Pocket Monsters found itself knee-deep in development hell. Crunch was a serious problem, with guys sleeping at their desks until all 3 programmers quit the same day. It looked like it was going to be the end of Pokemon, until their composer, Junichi Masuda, vowed to learn programming and pick up the pieces. Not long after, their hardware crashed, and they thought they'd lost years of work, the entire project. But again, Masuda promised to learn a new operating system to save the day. At the time, Sugimori was basically art director, but he wasn't officially a Game Freak employee. He was still drawing manga, submitting to publishers, and hoping to become a professional mangaka. But he could see that Pocket Monsters was falling apart, and the only way it could survive was for everyone to pull together and give 100%. That was the day he gave up his mangaka dreams and joined Game Freak full-time. It was the only way to help his friends achieve their dreams. They got some new programmers, including Shigeki Morimoto, who also contributed a few designs, like Mankey and Tauros. Another employee, Motofumi Fujiwara, came up with some Eevee forms, but something was still missing. "We need more cute ones," Sugimori realized. And since I was designing from the perspective of a man, I asked female artist Atsuko Nishida to join. Atsuko went on to make Pikachu, Bulbasaur, Charmander, Squirtle, and dozens more. Everyone had their own specialties and design philosophies. Then in the end, Sugimori revised everyone's creations and gave them watercolor artwork, thus unifying all their disparate designs into one consistent encyclopedia of 150. By the time Pokemon hit store shelves in 1996, it'd been over half a decade since Sugimori sketched the first monster. Game Freak was hoping maybe they could sell 1 million copies, since that's how many they'd need for trading between friends to be feasible. Sales were slow, at first, but gradually picked up as word of mouth spread, especially after rumors surrounding a secret 151st Pokemon. Sales doubled, then doubled again, then again. Usually a game's sales drop off after the first couple weeks, but Pokemon only gained momentum, and finally reached number 1 on Japanese sales charts more than a year after launch. Eventually, Pokemon fever spread westward and sold a total of nearly 50 million copies worldwide, making it the best-selling game of all time. It wasn't until 1999 that the reality of it all caught up to Sugimori. I was on the Eurostar train from Paris to London. I decided to get up and go get a drink and walked up to the concession car. On my way up there, 2 kids were playing Pokemon with the link cable stretched across the aisle. As I approached, they lifted the cable for me to walk underneath. That's when it hit me how popular Pokemon had become. I never thought it'd be this huge, or dreamed someday it'd be an anime, or there'd be a movie. Sugimori drew some one-off Pokemon manga, and the entire team immediately got to work on Pokemon 2. Sugimori made a Pokemon based on his childhood pet bird who liked to stand on one foot, and a few more designers were hired to bring in fresh monster ideas. Just like Gen 1, Sugimori redrew and unified all the new monsters added for Johto. The pressure to live up to fans' expectations was enormous, but after a lot of hard work and a 2-year delay, Gen 2 took the world by storm all over again and sold another 30 million copies, proving Pokemon was much more than just a fad. But it wasn't without cost. Tajiri didn't have the stomach for it anymore. Even though Gold and Silver's credits identify him as the director, he'd actually relinquished the director's chair to Masuda mid-development. Then Tajiri faded into reclusive obscurity for the rest of his days, leaving Sugimori as Game Freak's most senior public-facing figure. Unfortunately, he was feeling a little burnt out too. After Gold and Silver were finished, he told a Japanese publication, "There's really not much I can't do with Pokemon. As a world, it's fairly open. That said, yeah, sometimes I feel tired of it. I'm still young, and there's still a lot more I want to do with pixel art." At this point, he was 34 years old. When asked which was his favorite of all of his creations, it wasn't a Pokemon. He said Pulseman from the old Sega game he directed. Over the next few years, the company pushed forward with more and more Pokemon games, releasing them at a quicker and quicker pace. Sugimori solidified his techniques and studied biology every day, like researching real-life birds' skeletal and wing structures to make bird Pokemon. And he'd always use a manga G-pen to outline Pokemon, saying, "A guy who still uses a G-pen, there's not many of us left in the gaming industry. I don't use tools to draw circles either. It's always freehand. I just don't like lines to be too neat. When you draw on paper, the lines look kind of rough when you look really close. I actually really like that. Maybe you could say I have some kind of line fetish. Most manga artists are very careful to clean up their lines, but I actually think it looks cool." Even in the modern digital age, he colors on a tablet like everyone else, but he still outlines with a G-pen because he likes the sensation of drawing on paper. Another design philosophy he follows is that Pokemon shouldn't be too cute or too cool. Quote, "For example, Luxray would have been even cooler if its head was a bit smaller and its eyes narrower. If a Pokemon seems too cool, I might try to give it a little something to make it uncool. Because, in short, if a Pokemon is too cool, it won't capture a player's heart." Even Pokemon created by other designers, he'd revise it to be less cute or less cool, believing it made the Pokemon more memorable. He felt the same way about the series' human protagonists and purposely made them uncool as well. Well, at least in his eyes. During a Gen 3 promotional tour, Nintendo Dream Magazine asked Game Freak how they felt about Nintendo. Masuda gave the kind of answer you would expect. "It's a company we can learn a lot from in terms of style and the creation process. They're always like a role model for us." Then it was Sugimori's turn. He said, "Actually, I prefer Sega." After everyone laughed, he caught himself and pivoted, adding, "Nintendo's really a role model." Truth was, he'd been Team Sega since his teenage years, and the Sega Genesis is his favorite console of all time. That's why his Twitter handle is Super32X. He named himself after a Sega Genesis add-on. And when Wii Virtual Console came out, the first games he bought weren't Nintendo. They were old Sega games. Even though he still had the original cartridges and consoles, he just loved them so much he wanted to buy them again. He's always been more of a Sega fan. When Gen 4 was in development, Sugimori felt an urge to return to Game Freak's roots, back to action games like Pulseman. Finally, make some pixel art that wasn't Pokemon for a change. He jumped back in the director's chair and made Drill Dozer for Game Boy Advance and drew a manga for it as well. Drill Dozer got review scores on par with Pokemon, low 80s, and Nintendo Power nominated it for GBA Game of the Year. Unfortunately, the sales were much lower than Pokemon, and it was the last game Sugimori ever directed. Over the coming years, he would gradually scale back his involvement in the Pokemon franchise. After serving as series art director from the very beginning, he gave that job up to his junior, Takao Unno, for Heart Gold and Soul Silver. By the time Sun and Moon rolled around, Sugimori was mostly just supervising other people's designs as, quote, an observer, and the only designs he directed were the Alolan forms of old Kanto Pokemon. To be clear, he didn't design them all himself, he just directed their designs. While that was going on, he made the cover art for all 3 Sega 3D Classic collections. The collections didn't even include any Game Freak games, he drew them purely out of passion. Around the same time, he also published an art book, Ken Sugimori Works, which only devoted around 5% of its pages to Pokemon content. The rest was Quinty, Pulseman, manga, and other projects from his decades-long career. He's been explicit over the years how thankful he is for Pokemon's success, but sometimes it's apparent. He never wanted his whole life to amount to just being the Pokemon guy. Sugimori Works includes a 5-page interview where he gets pretty down on himself. He says he wasn't good enough to be a mangaka, and only able to make a living with art because in the 80s, quote, "It's kind of embarrassing to admit actually, but video games were a brand new industry back then, and standards were lower than in other fields. Both the games themselves and their packaging were poorly drawn. It was only when standards were so low that someone like me could get in." He goes on to say he never thought his art was any good, and he lacks confidence because he didn't go to art school, that all the younger designers at Game Freak did go to art school, and he feels inadequate. "I'm worried I'll outlive my usefulness. All I have over the younger artists is experience." One of the interviewer's final questions is if he still wants to draw manga. He basically says, no, he's given up on it. Quote, "I drew a promotional manga that was included with Drill Dozer, and I also drew a manga as a pre-order bonus for Pokemon Mystery Dungeon in 2007. That was the last one. He used to draw at home in his free time, but not anymore." So where'd everybody end up? Atsuko Nishida made lots more Pokemon, but left Game Freak to become a freelancer over a decade ago, saying she wanted to work from home and do something other than Pokemon. She's been doing art for other series ever since, but occasionally contributes a Pokemon here and there on a freelance basis. After taking over directorial duties for Gen 2, Junichi Masuda went on to direct most of the mainline games up to the present day. Satoshi Tajiri's mostly been MIA since the late 90s, though staff say he still hung around the Game Freak office as recently as 2016, playing old arcade games and imparting wisdom to the younger devs. As for Ken Sugimori himself, he still lives in Tokyo, still friends with Tajiri, still working at Game Freak, mainly as a supervisor. He's got a Switch and has an affinity for Mario Kart and Animal Crossing, but mostly sticks to older games. Loves cats. He painted his parents' cat after it passed away a few years back. Doesn't draw much otherwise, certainly no manga. But he likes going to art exhibits where they have originals of his favorite childhood manga, standing real close and staring at them. I don't have such lofty dreams of creating something that will last for perpetuity. The words of a man rapidly approaching 60. It's been a long time since that teenager ran away from home, hoping to become a mangaka. Most artists would kill to be Ken Sugimori, to have their art and characters famous all around the world, made into TV shows, movies, toys, to be the Pokemon guy. But it wasn't the life he wanted, at least not for his entire life. A wise man once said, "Sometimes you can't escape success." Sugimori doesn't hate Pokemon. He still occasionally posts new Pokemon art on his Twitter, just for fun. But he also posts stuff like Pulseman, and that's kind of the point. The masses never played Pulseman or Drill Dozer, read his comics, or really had any interest in his creations outside Pokemon. But there's so much more to Ken Sugimori, a whole lifetime's worth, just waiting for his fans to discover, to read, play, and enjoy. To us, Ken Sugimori is much more than just the Pokemon guy. And if you're into creatures and cards and all that, check out DidYouKnowGaming's new game, DYouKnowGaming. It's available to pre-order right now, and you can even create your own card for the game. Link in the description. Or you can click this other video. I've been Nasu. If you want to hear more from me, you can hop over to my channel. I've done videos talking about Pokemon, among other games and related topics, so check that out if it interests you. We bought a lot of books from Japan and had them translated, but we also leaned on work the community did before we got here. So a huge special thanks to HiResPokemon, Helix Chamber, Glitterberri, Catstorm, Trxns, Shmuplations, CFK, and Shinji no Takari for all their contributions. And of course, thank you for watching. See you next time.